This video is learning targets 3 through 5 of units 4, talking about viruses and protists. So if we're talking about viruses, one of the big questions that often comes up with viruses is, are they alive? Well, a virus is nothing more than some proteins and some DNA that act as infectious agents. It can actually invade your cells, and they use your cells' internal machinery to replicate themselves. And so, in some sense, they're not composed of cells. They can't reproduce on their own. They have no metabolism. And so, in that sense, they're not living. But they can change over time. They can, evolve and reproduce as long as they have a host. And so, there are some traits that people, some scientists consider them as living. This is a picture of the Ebola virus that has changed in the years that it's been around. And so, viruses don't exhibit a lot of the traits of living things, but they do have some traits of living things. So how do viruses work? Well, here's a picture that kind of demonstrates this. The yellow blobs there are the little hexagons are the viruses. And so the cell takes a virus in because cells are, particularly your white blood cells, take everything in that's not you. And the virus is not you. Well, the virus it's just made of proteins, nothing more than proteins and DNA. If you remember, DNA codes for proteins. And so basically the DNA that's located inside the virus kind of codes to make more viruses. And so what ends up happening is the viral DNA gets in. So here's the viral DNA. It gets into your own DNA and begins making proteins, which you see here, which essentially are just pieces of the virus. Well, those viruses assemble themselves inside the cell, and once the cell gets full of them, or at a certain point, the cell will break open, and those viruses will spill out into the rest of the body and invade new cells. And so this is where the word viral comes from. Viral spreads very quickly. Well, viruses can spread very quickly using the same mechanism. Here are a couple common shapes for viruses. The helical shape doesn't look much like a helix, but you think of a helix like this. This is this shape here. The icosahedral shape, which is more of a geometric pattern. This particular picture doesn't look very geometric, but if you'll think like, something like this, this viruses that have this kind of hedron shape. And then the complex, which is not any particular shape at all. This is called a bacteriophage. These are viruses that attack bacteria, and they have this very complex shape, some helical shape, some icosahedral up here, and some other pieces that don't really fit description, and they look like little alien landing crafts. Now, viruses have two main life cycles. The life cycle that we just discussed, where the virus comes into your body, joins itself with your own DNA, and your DNA makes new viruses, and they come out. That is called the lytic cycle. When a virus is actually active, key word here, active, it's in this lytic cycle. Well, sometimes virus comes in, becomes part of your own DNA, and those cells replicate. The virus isn't actively making new copies of virus, but the cells are dividing, replicating, normal life cycle. This is called the lysogenic cycle, and this is when the virus is dormant. So the lysogenic cycle is when the virus is dormant, and then some kind of factor in your life, maybe it could be stress or some sort of pathogen or injury, can cause the virus to reactivate. Chickenpox is a great example of this, and most people, or young people, are vaccinated against chickenpox now, but used to everybody had chickenpox. Well, later in life, stress can cause the chickenpox virus to become reactivated, and it comes back as something called shingles. And so it's not a pleasant thing at all. Stress is oftentimes the cause of shingles. So that brings us to vaccines. A vaccine is a dead virus, essentially a dead virus, that basically teaches your body to form immunity when it comes in contact with a real virus. Without going into the specifics of the immune system at this point, the body can learn how to fight against a particular kind of pathogen, a particular kind of virus. Well, if you put a dead virus, a virus that is incapable of becoming active, into the system, the body will learn how to fight against that virus without actually having to fight against it. And so that when it comes in contact with the real thing, the body's better equipped to fight that off and doesn't actually become infected. Vaccines have been very essential in average life expectancy and these kinds of things coming up, because diseases like smallpox and mumps and measles and polio and many of the world's terrible diseases are now essentially eradicated because of vaccines. So very, very good things. That brings us to protists. Protists are essentially any eukaryotic cell that isn't a fungi, plant, or animal. They're usually single-celled, but they're not bacteria because they have a nucleus, they have chromosomes, they divide through mitosis, the whole 9 yards, and some of them even sexually reproduce. So these are not bacteria, but some of them are single-celled. So again, eukaryotes that aren't fungi, plants, or animals, kind of a catch-all group a little bit. Now there are different kinds of protists, and they resemble other kingdoms. So there are animal-like protists. These are called zooflagellates because they have a, zo is animal, flagella is the way that they travel. So they have a flagella that they travel with. That's why they're called zooflagellates. Sarcodines, these are amoebas. They move using pseudopodia. Remember pseudopodia from a previous unit. And they move around by extending parts of their body. You can kind of see those pseudopodia here, and that little green thing's about to get wrapped up. But they move around through those pseudopodia. This is amoebas. Ciliates, they move around using cilia, and the cilia is these hair-like projections. You can really see it well in this picture. This is a paramecium, and this looks like a little hairy slipper or something going through through its kingdom there of grass or whatever that is. But it uses those cilia to move. And then lastly, these animal-like protists are called sporozoans. And sporozoans are the type of protists that act as parasites. This picture here shows the parasite that causes malaria. Mosquitoes actually transfer malaria, but it's this little protist that causes malaria to occur. It's not a mosquito that actually gives it to you. It's this protist that causes it. There are plant-like protists. They are plant-like because they do photosynthesis. Algae is a good example of this. There's some algae that does photosynthesis. Another type of plant-like protists are called diatoms. Diatoms are interesting in that they make their own glass case. Yes, same kind of glass that you're thinking about, silicon dioxide. They encase themselves in glass and they make all these neat shapes. Some other fungus-like protists. These are heterotrophs that absorb nutrients from dead material. So they're just like a fungus in that regard, but they're not fungi. They don't have cell walls like fungi. Well, here's an example of a fungus-like protist called a slime mold. They're kind of this gelatinous structure. They can be even like powdery like. This particular slime mold is actually called the dog vomit slime mold, and that's not a joke. Um, and some other people call them the scrambled egg mold, which again is not a joke. Those are actual common names for this slime mold, neither of which are particularly appetizing. All right, so how do they reproduce? They can reproduce asexually, like you see here on the right. Asexual reproduction is just simple mitosis. Cell divides, like we've talked about before. But in sexual reproduction, you see on the right, they join together. And what's happening is they are actually exchanging genetic material. There's a swapping of genetic material in order to produce a new organism. And so this is a new idea um, in the kingdoms that we've talked about so far. Well, we've talked about bacteria, so bacteria don't sexually reproduce. And so this is a new idea. And sexual reproduction is better in that it gives more variation, allows for better adaptation. Asexual reproduction can be better in that it's faster, and it's not required that you find a mate. But at the end of the day, sexually reproducing organisms dominate the earth because they are able to adapt simply by making a new organism from the copy of both parents' DNA.